The sun had long dipped below the horizon, and the sky above the small cemetery was a swirl of dark, heavy clouds. The air was thick with a damp chill, the kind of evening where everything felt heavier than usual. The wind whispered through the trees, a constant reminder of the approaching storm. The atmosphere was unsettling, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jacob the gravedigger stood at the edge of an open grave, his hands gripping the shovel with familiarity. He had done this job for years, digging graves, lowering the deceased into the earth, and covering them again. It was a lonely job, one that didn't require much thought, just the steady rhythm of digging and filling. But tonight something felt off. As he scooped another shovelful of dirt into the hole, a faint sound reached his ears. It was so soft at first he thought it was just the wind playing tricks. But then it came again, faint but unmistakable. A cry, a soft, desperate cry that seemed to come from deep within the earth. Jacob froze, the shovel still in his hand. His heart skipped a beat. He looked around, his eyes scanning the dim, empty graveyard. There was no one else around. Just the wind, the trees, and the growing darkness. But the sound, it wasn't from the wind. It was a cry, a child's cry. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He had worked in this cemetery for years and he knew the grounds well. There had never been any reason for a child's voice to come from beneath the earth. His eyes darted to the open grave in front of him. Could it be a trick of the mind? Had the long hours of digging and working in solitude started to play games with him? But then the cry came again, this time louder, more desperate, as if begging for help. It sent a chill down Jacob's spine, and his legs felt unsteady as he dropped the shovel, the metallic clang of it hitting the ground, breaking the eerie silence. Without thinking, Jacob stumbled toward the edge of the grave, his eyes now wide with fear and confusion. He knelt down and pressed his ear to the cold ground, straining to hear. The sound was unmistakable now, clear and filled with sorrow. A child's cry, muffled by the layers of earth, but still there. "Hello," Jacob called out, his voice shaking. "Is someone there?" For a moment there was nothing. No sound, no response. Just the wind howling through the cemetery. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. Had he imagined it? Was he just hearing things? But then he heard it again. This time the cry was louder, closer. There was no mistaking it. Someone, something, was crying from beneath the ground. The voice was so small, so innocent, that it pierced through the stillness of the graveyard, wrapping itself around Jacob's heart and squeezing. Panic set in as he scrambled to his feet, his eyes scanning the grave, the trees, the entire cemetery. Who would bury a child here? And why? Without thinking, Jacob grabbed the shovel and began to dig, his hands working quickly and desperately, his breaths coming in shallow bursts. The sky above darkened further as the clouds rolled in and the wind picked up. The storm was coming, but it didn't matter to Jacob now. All that mattered was the child's voice, the desperate cries that seemed to tear at his soul. He dug faster, heart racing, his hands aching as he lifted the shovel and tossed aside the dirt. The cry grew louder, more frantic, and it spurred him on. He had to find the source. He had to help. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the shovel hit something solid, a surface that wasn't just dirt. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. He had found it. He quickly cleared away the rest of the dirt, his hands trembling as he unearthed the source of the cry. What he uncovered next would change everything. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he cleared the final layers of dirt. Sweat dripped from his brow, his muscles aching from the strain of the frantic digging. But he couldn't stop now. He couldn't turn back. The cries from below were too real, too filled with pain and fear. As the last of the dirt fell away, Jacob found what he had been searching for. Beneath the surface, wrapped in a tattered cloth, was a small wooden box. It was old, the wood weathered and cracked, but it seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, like a heartbeat that echoed through the air. Jacob's hands shook as he reached down and carefully lifted the box from the grave, the weight of it heavier than he expected. The crying stopped abruptly. Jacob froze, the box now in his hands, his breath caught in his throat. For a long moment, there was only silence, thick, oppressive, and all-encompassing. It was as if the entire graveyard had held its breath. The wind had died down, the air heavy with the anticipation of what he would find. What was inside this box? Was it really a child? Or something far worse? A feeling of dread washed over him, yet his curiosity was stronger. He had to know. Slowly, carefully, Jacob began to pry open the lid of the box, his hands trembling. The wood creaked with age, but it gave way, revealing what lay inside. A bundle of cloth. At first it seemed like nothing more than a worn, old blanket, but as Jacob pulled it back, he found something that made his heart nearly stop. It wasn't a child, it was a doll, but not just any doll. This one was different. Its face was cracked and worn, its eyes dark and hollow, as if staring into the depths of the grave itself. The doll had a strange, unsettling look to it, one that sent chills down Jacob's spine. It was beautifully crafted, but there was something wrong about it, something that made it feel alive, as if it had been waiting for him to uncover it. And there, beneath the doll, was something even more disturbing, a small, folded piece of parchment. Jacob's hands trembled as he reached for it, his heart pounding as he carefully unfolded the paper. The message on the paper was short but chilling. She was never meant to be forgotten. Jacob's mind raced. What did this mean? What had he uncovered? The words seemed to burn into his mind, and for a moment he felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. The cries, the child's voice, had all led him here, to this moment, and now the weight of the discovery pressed down on him. His gaze flicked back to the doll. The hollow eyes seemed to follow him, as though they were alive, watching him, waiting for him to understand. Jacob's breath quickened, his mind struggling to make sense of it. Was the child he had heard crying a ghost? Was this some kind of twisted prank, or was something far more sinister at play? And then, as if in response to his thoughts, a cold breeze swept through the graveyard, carrying with it a faint whisper. It was almost too soft to hear, but Jacob could make out the words. You should have left it alone. The voice was unmistakable, just as soft, just as desperate as the cries he had heard before. Jacob's pulse raced. His hands shook as he dropped the parchment and looked back down at the doll. The air around him felt colder, the graveyard darker. He wasn't alone anymore. There was something here, something that had been buried with this doll, something that had been waiting for him. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and he suddenly felt the overwhelming need to leave, to run far from this place. But something kept him rooted to the spot. He couldn't move, couldn't look away from the doll that seemed to stare back at him with eyes that no longer belonged to a child. Suddenly, he realized that the air was thick with an energy he couldn't explain. The cemetery, the grave, the doll. It all felt wrong, like he had stepped into a place where time and reality no longer existed. Something had been disturbed, something ancient, and Jacob wasn't sure if he could handle whatever came next. The wind picked up again, louder now, howling through the trees. The cries, the whispers, they all seemed to merge together into a single haunting sound that filled the air around him. Jacob stepped back, his hand clutching the doll, but as he tried to turn and flee, he heard a voice, this time louder than before. Don't take her! Jacob froze. His heart skipped a beat. The voice had come from directly behind him. Slowly he turned, and there, standing in the darkened corner of the graveyard, was a figure. A woman, or at least something that looked like one. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, staring directly at him with a look of terror and grief. Her lips parted to speak again, but no sound came. Only the faintest, chilling whisper. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as the figure stood motionless in the shadows, her presence almost unnatural. His eyes widened as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing, but nothing about this moment made sense. The woman, or whatever she was, stayed silent, her hollow eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made the hairs on his neck rise. The chilling whisper had been barely audible, but now he could feel it in his bones, a deep, unsettling vibration that seemed to come from the very ground beneath him. His fingers tightened around the doll, but he wasn't sure why he was holding it. Was it an instinct to protect himself, or was it something else, something far darker? The woman didn't speak again, but her presence alone was enough to send a cold shiver through his spine. Who, who are you? Jacob's voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper, but it felt as if the question might shatter the fragile silence that hung around them. He didn't want to ask. He didn't want to know the answer. But there was something about this place, about the doll, about the voice that had whispered to him, that he couldn't escape. The woman's lips trembled, her pale face ghostly in the dim light, and as she took a slow step forward, her feet making no sound against the earth, Jacob's heart began to pound. She moved without the slightest sound, her eyes locked onto his, as if she were pulling him in, drawing him deeper into something he didn't understand. You shouldn't have uncovered it, the woman said suddenly, her voice weak but clear, carrying a weight of sorrow that Jacob couldn't ignore. She was meant to stay hidden. The child, she must never be remembered, not by you, not by anyone. Jacob's chest tightened. The child? He echoed, his voice cracking with a mixture of confusion and fear. What do you mean? What's going on here? The woman's face contorted in a mixture of grief and fury, and she reached out toward him, her hands trembling, as if trying to touch the doll in his grip. Her eyes filled with tears, which seemed to drip silently from her cheeks. You have no idea what you've done, she whispered, her voice breaking. You've brought her back, and now it's too late. She paused and her gaze seemed to pierce through him, as if seeing not just his physical form, but something deeper, something hidden within his soul. She will not rest now. She cannot. The wind picked up again, swirling around them in a gust that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. Jacob stepped back, the doll in his hand feeling heavier with each passing moment. His mind raced, the panic and fear starting to cloud his thoughts. The figure before him had spoken of a child, of something that had been buried and forgotten. What had he uncovered? What had he done? Please, Jacob stammered, his eyes desperately searching the graveyard for any sign of help. What do you want from me? Who are you? The woman's lips parted once more, but this time her words came out in a low, hollow whisper, like an incantation. She is not gone, not truly, and now she will find you. The air around them grew cold, colder than it had ever been, and Jacob felt his body tremble with a deep sense of dread that consumed him from the inside out. The woman took one final step toward him, her face now inches from his, her breath icy against his skin. Suddenly, the ground beneath Jacob's feet seemed to shift, as if the very earth was beginning to awaken. He stumbled backward, his heart racing in terror, but there was no escape. He had uncovered something that should have remained buried forever, and now he was trapped. The figure vanished just as quickly as she had appeared, leaving behind only the sound of the wind howling through the trees, the soft rustling of leaves. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Jacob's heavy breathing as he struggled to make sense of what had just happened. The doll in his hands felt unnaturally warm now, and he realized with a sickening lurch in his stomach that something had changed. Something inside the doll, something that had lain dormant, was now awake. Jacob looked back toward the open grave, and in the growing darkness, he swore he saw movement. A shadow, small and fleeting, passed over the freshly turned earth. He wasn't alone anymore. The voice of the child that had cried from deep within the ground suddenly returned, louder now, closer. But this time, there was no mistaking it. It was no longer a cry of sadness. It was a call, an angry, desperate wail, and it was coming for him. Jacob's heart slammed against his chest as the cries grew louder, more frantic, like a chorus of voices rising from the very earth beneath him. The air around him felt charged with energy, thick with something unexplainable and ancient. He could feel the weight of the doll in his hands like a curse, its presence burning against his palms. He didn't know what was happening or why, but he knew that he had awoken something far worse than he had ever imagined. The cries from below were no longer just voices. They were almost tangible, like the hands of 1,000 souls reaching up from the grave, pulling him toward the darkness. His legs trembled as he took a step back, his mind racing to make sense of everything. The wind howled once more, the shadows creeping along the ground, as if the cemetery itself was alive with the restless energy of something that had been buried for far too long. With a shaky breath, Jacob turned and fled, the doll still clutched tightly in his hand. He didn't know what had happened or what force had been awakened by his digging, but he knew he had to get out. The village, the people, everything that had been safe and familiar seemed so distant now. The graveyard, once a place of quiet, peaceful rest, had turned into something else entirely. It was as if the earth itself had decided to reclaim something it had lost. His boots pounded against the path leading out of the graveyard, the cries growing louder with each step he took. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear, but the sound of the voices, the relentless wailing, was the only thing that held his attention now. He had to get away from the cemetery. He had to escape whatever it was that had been disturbed by his actions. As he neared the edge of the graveyard, he glanced back one last time. The moon had risen high in the sky, casting an eerie light over the graves. The wind had picked up again, but this time it carried with it something more, something cold and unnatural. Jacob froze in his tracks as he saw it. The figure of a small child appeared, standing in the center of the graveyard, just beyond the gates. Its small form was almost ghostly, pale against the dark earth, its features obscured by the shadows. The wail of the child's cry had stopped, but the silence that followed was more terrifying than anything Jacob had ever felt. It was as if the world had gone still, waiting, watching. The child didn't move, didn't blink. It simply stood there, its dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made Jacob's blood run cold. It was as though the child had been waiting for him, watching him from the moment he had uncovered the doll. He felt a cold hand grip his chest, his heart tightening in terror. The child raised a small hand, pointing directly at him. And in that instant, Jacob felt the weight of 1,000 souls bearing down on him. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a voice. This time, it was no longer a wail. It was a command. "Bring her back." Jacob stumbled backward, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. His eyes were locked on the figure of the child, who now took a single step toward him. The child's voice, though soft, was filled with a power that could not be ignored. "Bring her back," the voice repeated, a cold, hollow echo that seemed to seep into Jacob's bones. The child's gaze never left him, as if it were trying to pull something from deep inside him, something he didn't want to give. Jacob's hands trembled, the doll still clutched tightly in his grasp. He could feel the weight of the curse now, the gravity of what he had done. The child's command burned through him, the impossible truth of it sinking in. He had disturbed something that should have been left alone. Jacob felt the ground shift beneath him as the earth seemed to tremble in response to the child's words. The cries rose again, filling the night air, drowning him in their intensity. They were no longer the cries of a single child. They were the wails of many, the sorrow of those who had been buried with their secrets. "No!" Jacob shouted, backing away from the figure, his mind screaming for him to run. "I didn't mean to," but the child's voice, now like a cold whisper in the wind, cut him off. "You will bring her back." Jacob's heart thudded in his chest. He looked down at the doll, the one thing he had retrieved from the grave, the very thing that seemed to be the source of all this madness. And then, without thinking, he tossed it away, the doll tumbling to the ground. But the child didn't move. "Please," Jacob gasped, his throat dry, his voice breaking with desperation. "What do you want from me?" The child's eyes glowed now, faintly like two dark pools of endless sorrow. It spoke again, its voice soft, but filled with an undeniable force. "Bring her back, or you will never leave." A sudden gust of wind whipped through the graveyard, howling with an unearthly force. The ground rumbled, and Jacob stumbled as the earth began to shift beneath his feet, the soil around him swirling like a storm. The voices of the lost, the crying, the wailing grew louder, until it felt like the very air was choking him. Jacob's eyes widened in terror as he realized the truth. This wasn't just a grave he had uncovered. It was a prison, and by digging into it, by disturbing it, he had awakened something far darker than he could ever have imagined. The child stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. And then, the earth beneath Jacob's feet cracked open. Jacob's breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. The ground beneath him seemed to split open with a deafening crack, and he fell to his knees, his hands trembling in the cold earth. The air around him grew thick with an unnatural force, the whispers of countless souls rising up from the cracks in the ground. He could feel them, surrounding him, pressing in on all sides, their cries echoing in his mind, filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread. The child stood motionless before him, its eyes glowing brighter now, like twin pools of sorrow and rage. Its voice, soft but powerful, sounded again, colder than ever. "You've awakened her." Jacob's mind raced. Her? Who was she? What did it mean? He didn't have time to question it. All he could think about was the overwhelming sense of doom that pressed against him, like the very earth was about to swallow him whole. He knew he couldn't run. The child had made it clear that escape was no longer an option. He was bound to this place, bound to whatever had been buried beneath the earth. With a desperate cry, Jacob scrambled to his feet and reached for the doll that had fallen to the ground. His hands were slick with sweat, his body trembling, but he grabbed it, clutching it to his chest. It was his only hope, he realized. He didn't know why, but the doll was the key. He had to return it. He turned to the grave, still open, the dirt now beginning to shift violently, as if something was stirring deep within. The whispers grew louder, the wailing more intense, and the air around him crackled with a dark energy that made his skin crawl. The child remained silent, watching him with its unblinking eyes, waiting. Jacob didn't hesitate. He rushed to the grave and threw the doll into the hole, the earth quaking beneath his feet. The moment the doll landed, a deafening silence filled the graveyard, and for a fleeting second, Jacob dared to believe that it was over, that he had stopped whatever evil had been unleashed. But then the ground beneath him cracked wide open. The child's face twisted into an expression of rage, and the voices in the air reached a crescendo. Jacob could barely breathe as the earth swallowed the doll, pulling it deeper into the grave. The whispers became a deafening roar, filling his ears, and a dark figure began to emerge from the earth. A figure cloaked in shadow, its form monstrous, towering and terrifying. The earth groaned and shifted as the figure rose, the very soil around it writhing like it had a life of its own. Jacob fell to his knees, overcome with fear and helplessness. The figure was growing stronger, its form becoming clearer. It was the spirit of the child, no longer innocent, no longer a mere ghost. It had been trapped beneath the earth for years, forgotten, abandoned, and now it was free. "No!" Jacob screamed, his voice barely audible over the deafening noise. "I didn't mean it. I didn't know." The spirit turned toward him, its hollow eyes locking onto his with an intense fury. "You have disturbed her." The voice came not from the child, but from the dark figure rising out of the grave, its voice booming and filled with malevolent power. It was no longer a child's whisper. It was something much darker, ancient, and vengeful. Jacob's hands trembled as he tried to push himself away from the grave, but the ground seemed to pull at him. He couldn't move. He couldn't escape. The figure loomed over him, its shape now fully revealed, twisted and contorted, its face a grotesque mask of rage and sorrow. The child's form had been consumed by something much darker. "You have freed her," the spirit said, its voice now cold and unforgiving. "And now you will pay the price." Jacob's heart beat painfully in his chest, and for the first time he understood. The child wasn't a victim of a tragic past. She was a prison, a curse, a malevolent force that had been buried to keep it from destroying everything in its path. And by uncovering the doll, by disturbing the grave, Jacob had unleashed something that should never have been disturbed. The spirit's eyes burned into him, and a wave of cold washed over him as it reached out with twisted, skeletal hands. He could feel the darkness consuming him, his breath growing shallow, his limbs stiff with fear. Suddenly there was a loud crack, and the earth seemed to shake violently. The figure began to fade into the shadows, its form melting back into the soil, but not before its voice echoed one final time. "You will never escape her, And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the ground fell silent. Jacob, breathless and terrified, looked around him. The graveyard was still. The cries had stopped. The wind had stilled. But the darkness lingered, filling the air like a presence that would never leave. The grave had closed. The child was gone. But the weight of what had been unleashed remained. And Jacob knew that whatever had been disturbed by his actions would haunt him forever. He stumbled backward, finally able to move, his body weak with fear. He looked down at the doll still clutched in his hand. It had been the key, and now it was his curse. The cries may have stopped, but Jacob knew the truth. The darkness would always follow him, waiting, watching. The child had been freed, but its power, its curse would never truly be gone.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.